that evaluation component, as well as just penetration testing in general. So like the slide says, penetration testing is trying to perform authorized testing against an environment to identify and exploit weaknesses that might be present. So that affects targeted or network systems, applications, and the people in some cases if we're talking about social engineering. And so the reason that we perform penetration testing is really so that we can, try and find these issues before a bad guy does. So when we're talking about external applications and systems, the goal is to try and identify those issues that are most likely to be identified by someone who, identifies that particular network component externally, and tries to exploit those to gain access to your environment. So you really want to try and get, a lead, on that process by identifying those yourself, having a professional, tell you what the risk is associated with those, and best practice remediation so that you can take action on those before you find out after an attack has happened. So is it required for HIPAA? In the law, if you read through the security rules specifically, it's not explicitly stated that penetration testing must be performed. However, if you look at this excerpt from the standard evaluation section, you can see specifically I italicized technical and non-technical evaluation. So technical evaluation, we're talking about an information system, it is known to be penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, active testing against those systems to try and identify weaknesses and close those holes and protect your system. So while it doesn't particularly say or specifically say penetration testing must be performed, that technical evaluation, is generally thought to mean, that active testing that would come from penetration testing. And so another resource that you can look at when you're trying to understand, whether or not penetration testing should be a part of your, your approach to HIPAA compliance is NIST publication 866. It's actually revision 1 now. But if you look at the evaluation section, which sort of references back to the last slide that I mentioned there, their specific guidance here is to conduct penetration testing if reasonable and appropriate. And the example that they give in parentheses here is where trusted insiders attempt to compromise system security for the sole purpose of testing the effectiveness of security controls. So what they're identifying there is an internal penetration test. And so, NIST is saying that it's reasonable and appropriate for the purpose of HIPAA, compliance to consider internal penetration testing if, based on your initial risk assessment and your ongoing risk assessment activities, that makes sense for your organization. So when I talk about these points here, I'm not going to speak specifically to each of them. I'll talk about the first two separately, and then the last three kind of together. But initially, the compliance requirements, as I mentioned before, HIPAA doesn't explicitly state that penetration testing must be performed. But when you think about the appropriate methods you can use to confirm that a system is secure or that it's operating at the level of security you're comfortable with, again, based on that risk assessment that I mentioned before, you naturally come to the conclusion that some active testing must take place. That active testing, in the case of network systems, applications, things like that, is generally going to be a penetration test and or vulnerability assessment. So the other side of that to think about is if you're looking to comply with HIPAA, but you also have other compliance requirements, you want to approach penetration testing in a way that will allow you to adhere to all of the different compliance frameworks that you might be bound to, as well as just general good security. And so that's why you would want to think about that. So if for example, you have HIPAA and PCI and you need to comply with both, then your scoping might require you to look at systems that are that include both a PCI CDE, but might also then include other systems that are outside of that CDE, but include systems that in the way that PCI describes it, transmit, process, or store electronic protected health information. So, Your testing goals, what I mean by that is that when you have decided that you want to perform a penetration test, it's really up to your organization to determine what is appropriate, what the goals of that test should be. As a penetration tester, I can give you some guidance on what I think should be tested based on, just my limited understanding of your environment. But you should really have some goals in mind. So, an example of that would be if, for example, you're a covered entity who has a business associate that has remote access to your environment, or maybe even you just have, inside employees that have some sort of VPN or Citrix access to your environment, and you want to really understand what the security risks to that level of access are. You might decide that performing a penetration test, particularly on the infrastructure side, should be focused on that external access to that environment. And beyond that, what would happen if access were gained to the environment, where you might start to talk about internal testing and what sort of devices internally you might want to test. So that's just a sort of generic example, but the idea is you want to, going back to that risk assessment again, it's really sort of the core of all of this. That risk assessment is going to, is where you're going to decide what those, those risks are, and so your testing goals would align with those and determine how you approach penetration testing and what systems should be in place. So, like I said, the last three I'm going to kind of talk about together because they sort of, relate to one another. But so the size and complexity of your organization is a key consideration. Once you've identified that these particular systems or devices have access to EPHI, and you know that you want to have those in scope. You also, you want to decide if, what systems outside of those might need to be in scope based on how they're used, and based on other locations that are either in the same environment or in a related environment that's external to that primary scope that might need to be included as well. As you get larger, as you start to evaluate scope for a larger organization, it becomes important to really limit that to, to systems that are most likely to be affected, and also systems that are not protected in ways that they should be. For example, most organizations don't do as good a job as they should with segmentation. And so whether we're talking about a single, office location or a, distributed, widely distributed, offices or hospitals or things like that across the country, you have to look at what your size and complexity, of your organization is, so that what that scope should be, and you can properly limit it in order to exclude things that might otherwise increase costs, increase time for the project, without really giving you any additional benefit. So the second to last point there, the controls in place that you have, as I mentioned, segmentation and things like that, those controls will really determine, how the test takes place. So if there's a significant amount of segmentation in your environment, but there are systems on all sides of that segmentation that need to be tested, then that will have an impact on how testing is performed. So in the case of internal testing, that might require the deployment of multiple devices in various segmented environments in order to get a full picture of those those environments and the systems that are within those. And that last one I kind of wraps into those other two, just that when you think about a penetration test, the more time that is required, and basically time is very closely tied to the scope, the more time that's involved, the higher the financial impact you're going to see with the penetration test. So that's why it's important to understand what should be in scope and to limit it where it makes sense, both from a technical and and from a financial perspective, to be able to have a good penetration test and have those core systems included, without including so much that the test is the approach is sort of weakened, and that there's too much to look at and not enough focus on the things that should be tested. So these are the most common penetration testing approaches that you hear about when you sort of read about penetration testing. Maybe you've never done it, but you're sort of looking into it. These are the common approaches. So the first is black box, and black box is sort of I guess as the name suggests, it's very, very little about the target that you're testing. Sometimes all that is the name of the organization. You know, in the case of, in the penetration testing world, obviously there's some legality, you know, so there needs to be a you know, engagement letter and that sort of thing between you and the organization. But a black box approach really starts with the penetration tester or the testing firm knowing very little about the scope of your environment. You know, so in this case, a very heavy emphasis is placed on reconnaissance, where you know, your tester goes out and tries to identify as much as possible about your organization, you know, about the employees that you have, the network resources they can identify, web applications, all of those things, you know, to increase their chances of success during the project. So as we move on, the gray box is you start to get a little bit more information when we talk about gray box, and this is actually the most common approach that Kirkpatrick Price takes. Gray box is limited information. So we don't know every control that you have in place. We don't know, you know, every system that's in your environment, but we start to try and gather as much information as we can to improve the efficiency of testing. So, you know, that's network blocks, maybe, you know, web application URLs, and just the basic information we need to get started testing. So in the case of web application, we still wouldn't know necessarily the you know, the backend database type, for example, the web server that's or web application server that's supporting that application, and other information that will be disclosed in the next point here. So white box is really, it's giving your tester the keys to the kingdom. This approach is basically saying, I'm going to provide you everything that I know to be true in my environment, or the scope that we're testing. So that might be a complete, you know, detailed network diagram, data flow diagram, in this case for where EPHI travels or is stored in your environment, specific, you know, types of systems that are in use, and maybe even the exact IP addresses and open ports and services. I mean, it's you sharing as much as you know to be true and all the security controls that you know to be in place to allow that tester to then say, okay, this is what you know, the security you believe exists based on these controls, these firewall rules, etc. And then they start to perform testing with that knowledge in mind in order to try and circumvent those known controls and really try to give you the most value and show you the reality of those controls that you have in place. So I won't talk a lot here. This is just basically the common types of penetration testing that you'll see. So internal, external infrastructure is, you know, as the name suggests, it's looking at those, you know, workstations, servers, networking devices such as firewalls, printers, IP cameras, those sorts of things, and trying to identify vulnerabilities and weaknesses in those systems that can be leveraged by an attacker. Similarly, web application testing is looking specifically at those, you know, web applications that you might have either on an internal network, or exposed externally. So the goal there is to, you know, to identify and leverage web application specific attacks and exploits that might allow access to the application and you know, associated, you know, EPHI or whatever the protected data may be in the case of a general penetration test. Or even maybe allow, you know, using that application to pivot into the infrastructure side of things. So wireless assessments, you know, that could be, you know, the testing of a guest wireless implementation to, you know, to ensure that you know, that deployment is not able to, the guests, you know, wireless users are not able to sort of pivot to other networks in your environment. It can also be used on the, you know, sort of on the LAN side or the more, you know, protected secure network side to determine if there are any rogue devices that shouldn't be on the wireless network, as well as to try and track down, you know, other unknown devices that are connected wirelessly. And generally, you know, that assessment can also be used to you know, confirm that what you believe to be, you know, in place as far as security controls is in fact in place and operating effectively. The last point there, social engineering, that really covers sort of the human aspect of hacking. What we're looking for there is, you know, the typical phishing scenarios that you I'm sure have heard of, especially in recent years. You know, so sending a malicious, you know, an email with a malicious attachment or with a link to a website that has a drive-by download or something of that nature. But this could also be, you know, in-person social engineering. So, you know, trying to trick people at a local office or in a hospital or wherever the case may be into providing access to or directly divulging, you know, protected information that should otherwise be restricted. And I think I talked a little longer than I intended to do that. So this is where we start to talk about, just our methodology, Patrick Price and our penetration testing team's, approach to penetration testing. And so you can see the main points here. We'll talk about each as we go through the slide. So the information gathering phase, this is pre-engagement activity. This is really where we have signed a letter of engagement with someone. So we have a general idea of what the scope is, but this is the opportunity for the actual penetration tester who will be delivering the project to interface with the technical and non-technical folks at the organization that we're testing for, in order to understand in detail what that scope should look like. Again, understanding that there may be varied levels of information shared here based on the type of approach we're taking. But generally speaking, when we're talking about sort of internal, external web application testing, all of those together, we start to try and understand what level of access we need so that we can make plans for an internal appliance or VPN connectivity to your environment if internal testing is in scope. And also that trying to understand what all systems we need to have access to ahead of testing. We might also, depending again on the approach that we take, start to identify areas in your network where ePHI is stored, specifically in the case of HIPAA. And I mentioned there in parentheses, store, process, transmit. Again, as I said before, that's sort of borrowed from the PCI world, but I think it very much applies when we're talking about HIPAA in helping to understand where that data flows in your environment, so that you can better determine and establish scope before engaging someone for a penetration test, and when you start to talk to someone like myself, who's the technical person that will actually be performing that test. And last, we'll talk about scheduling. So that's exactly as it says. We start to put dates on the calendar and understand what milestones exist and things like that, so that you know how testing will progress. You can establish when and how you're contacted. And those sorts of things. So then we start to, once that planning call is over, we send sort of a summary of that, and we start to work on the scope that we've been provided. So, the first thing that we do is just try and sanity check that scope. So we've been told you have, 3 active IPs. We might do some quick checks, just looking at, domains that belong to your organization, things like that. And other external resources to again sanity check that scope and see if it matches what we agreed upon and what we believe to be true of the assessment that we're performing. We also, as the second point there shows at the bottom, we start to look at network connectivity and confirming that those systems that we should be testing, that we actually have access to those systems. And all of that is really just to be able to feed back to our clients should we notice any issues before active engagement. So reconnaissance, again, going back to the approaches we talked about, black box, gray box, white box. Reconnaissance will the amount that's performed during a penetration test will depend on the approach we're taking. So as you recall, black box will be heavy reconnaissance focus. Gray box, certainly reconnaissance is important, so it's always going to be present, but it may not be as in-depth as it would during a black box engagement. And then for white box, again, maybe a little bit less, but certainly still a focus because of the importance of the information you can get back here. And some of the things to think about during the reconnaissance phase that for Patrick Price, the approach that we use is, we might take a look at your website, start to understand, what technologies are in use there. We might look at a careers page, specifically looking for technology employees, so, system administrators, developers, things of that nature. So that we can get an idea based on those job postings, what types of systems are in your environment. Typically if you're hiring a sysadmin and you're looking for Unix and Linux experience, you're probably not running an Active Directory domain and a large number of Windows systems. So we really we try to gather as much information as possible during the reconnaissance phase so that we are prepared, to start to take action on these things once we begin active testing. A couple of things we look for once we identify the systems that are in use, or as much as we can. We try and identify default configurations, for those systems to get an idea of whether or not there might be some default passwords, some insecure protocols in use, that sort of thing. We also start to look for published vulnerabilities for those systems. with the obvious, intent of trying to leverage those vulnerabilities as quickly as possible during the project to let you know, what the impact of those might be. Generally speaking, on the open source intelligence gathering side, that's when we sort of move from your website and we start to look at, start to perform, targeted Google, Bing, and Baidu and similar sorts of search engine queries to identify information about your organization, about your employees, again, about some of the technology that you're using, and really just trying to complete that picture of what your organization looks like from the outside, much the same way an attacker would. We also use some search engines and things that are not more, well known to your average, IT person. Shodan is a good example of one of those that can give us some information about systems that are externally exposed before we ever have to send a packet to a system that belongs to you. So this is the first active engagement, active testing phase during the project. So the discovery and scanning is where we start to, take that scope that we know to be, to be in effect during this project, and start to identify active systems that we can target for testing. So the first way that we do that is through what's known as a ping scan. That's essentially sending an ICMP request to that system and looking for an ICMP response that says, I'm active. That's just one of many ways. Ping is many times disabled as a, air quotes, security precaution, but it's not the be-all, end-all of determining if a system is discoverable. As you look at this third point here, selected TCP and UDP port scans. The way that we use that is, a system, if it's externally exposed and it's communicating for a particular purpose, is going to have, ports and services open that are accessible even if you can't ping to identify it. So we start to look at common ports and services that you might use for VPNs, for web services, so 80 and 443 TCP, and other common ports that will allow us to determine, is this host in a given range actually active and listening. So once we do that, we then start to perform a full port scan against these systems. So our typical approach is to perform a full TCP scan and a partial UDP scan. The reason for that has to do with the efficiency of performing scanning against UDP. Because of the nature of the protocol, it doesn't, it's not as easy to run a fast scan or an accurate scan against UDP services without more knowledge of what's actually running. So what we typically do is we limit that to very well-known services, so DNS, NTP, SNMP, that sort of thing, really looking for services that are most likely to be running, UDP services. On the TCP side, we do a full port scan, as I mentioned, and that, again, has to do with the nature of the protocol. So, we do port 1 through 605.35, looking for any port that's listening with a TCP service, whether it's identified or unidentified. Then we take that information, and you'll see this, or at least I'll mention it even if it's not listed, is that we always try to, as the very last step in a particular phase, go back and compare that to the initial scope, compare that to the previously gathered data, and try and make sure that we're still on track with respect to the scope that the organization has determined, and make sure that what we're collecting, the information we're getting back, and the systems that we are focused on are in scope and that we're not missing anything. So the vulnerability assessment, this, as you can see in the configure tools section, the vulnerability assessment may be infrastructure, it may be web applications. So for our primary tools here are Nessus on the infrastructure side and or Security Center for distributed nodes for multiple scanning appliances. Or HP Enterprise Web Inspect, which is what we use for web scanning of large applications, and some other automated tasks that are built in there. So basically the way that this works is we take the results of the previous phase, so all of that network discovery and scanning, and I didn't mention, but also crawling of web applications and things like that. All of that information we use to identify the systems and applications in your scope. We feed that into these tools so that we can start to perform vulnerability assessments. On the infrastructure side, again, I said we use Nessus. And you know, with that, we can tailor that scan to increase efficiency and sort of allow that scan to complete more quickly by feeding in specifically which ports and services are active, you know, which IPs are active, and reducing the task of doing that sort of discovery through Nessus itself. On the HP Enterprise side, we start to look at the application details that we gather during sort of the mapping and crawling phase of the application discovery, and we feed that in with the knowledge that we know as penetration testers. So, you know, making sure that we focus on areas that we believe to be the most significant sources of weaknesses in the application. That's not to say that we don't also include, you know, testing of a larger, you know, percentage of the application. But certainly we want to focus on those areas that we know historically from the type of work that we do are most vulnerable before we move on to testing the larger portions of the application. The next point, execute the vulnerability assessment. I think that goes without saying that's going to happen. And then we start to review the results and really try to understand, you know, from those results where we should go next. So we again, as the last point mentioned there, we go back, we compare the results of that vulnerability assessment to make sure that we didn't lose any hosts, you know, during the scanning. No hosts were dropped or lost from, you know, either from our testing or from systems being shut down or decommissioned or anything like that. Again, just mapping that back to the scope and all along, you know, the way, making sure that that we're still testing those systems that are expected from the client. So this is labeled confirmation and exploitation, but really this is where the meat of testing happens. So exploitation, when some people hear that word, they think, you know, purely throwing a particular exploit at a particular vulnerability. But this is really where we start to do any non-automated testing that happens during the project. We start to, you know, first start, as the first point shows there, we start by reviewing that vulnerability assessment, you know, report, looking for those issues that may be false positives to remove those, and starting to confirm the issues that, you know, that are present that are actually exploitable and need to be, you know, brought to the client's attention. Then, you know, under the exploitation area, again, is where I said the majority of our testing takes place. So certainly, if that is a known vulnerability and an exploit being, you know, executed against that will take place. But that's also where we start to form some other automated and manual exploitation. So some examples of that. On the automated side, for example, we have an application where through manual testing and some, you know, basic fuzzing in a web browser, we've identified a SQL injection flaw, for example. We might spend some time on that, trying to manually build that query out and leverage that attack, you know, exploiting that attack manually, or that vulnerability manually. But maybe we don't have that much success. We know it's vulnerable. We can't quite get to where we want to be. So we might leverage something like a SQL map, which is a tool, an excellent tool for performing automated SQL injection attacks against you know, known and unknown vulnerable parameters. So in this case, we could, you know, target specifically the parameter that we know to be vulnerable and allow, you know, leverage that tool to allow it to build out that query and find exactly how to, you know, properly exploit that vulnerability. On the manual side, it could be something as simple as you know, trying to, maybe you don't have that many web applications in your environment, so it doesn't make sense to try and bring to, you know, an automated authentication or brute forcing or application or something like that into play. So you may just go in and try some, you know, known passwords, again, going back to the sort of reconnaissance that we performed. Try some known passwords, try to leverage some known, you know, weak configuration issues. Really, there's too many things to list on the manual side and really also on the automated side that could take place during this process. But just understand that this is where we are, you know, doing the bulk of our data collection, whether that's, you know, doing man-in-the-middle attacks, you know, using tools like Responder to try and pull back hashes from Windows systems to try and crack those and gain access. Again, all of that sort of exploitation activity happens here. And then the last point, and really the most important during the penetration test, is that as we go along, we do our best to quickly identify those high-risk, easy identifiable issues so that we can notify clients as soon as possible. And all along the way, as we continue testing, even if the exploitation activity is very complex, as we go along, once we confirm an issue and we have enough information to provide that to the client and give them guidance on how to resolve it, we reach out as soon as we can to share that information and let them begin the remediation process as we're testing. So this is the most important part from a client perspective, not so much from the testing perspective, if I'm being honest. It's definitely the most monotonous part of penetration testing, but this is where all of the data collected from a penetration test is put into that final report that you'll receive. So the first step here is we basically look back through everything that we've collected, all of that data that we have put into what we call an artifacts file for you. Excuse me. We start to review screenshots, review our host lists, review the vulnerability assessments, and make sure that we've captured everything that we intended to and that we didn't leave anything behind that needed additional testing. Once we're fairly confident of that, we'll start to perform the actual drafting of the report. And these subpoints here really just kind of talking about how we structure our report. Which is, and this is our current report type. We have an executive summary which talks about, the schedule of testing, the types of testing that were performed at a very high level, as well as some quick summaries of each of the findings that are further down in the report and findings and recommendation section. We also talk about the results of each of the phases that took place during the project. Some other details you'll find there is a reference to that artifacts file that I mentioned, which contains basically all of the data we gathered during the project, as well as the complete list of hosts, ports, and services that were identified during testing. So the next point here, communication of issues to the client, this depends on the complexity of the project, the amount of time that's required for documentation. But the goal at the reporting phase is to make sure that anything that wasn't of a high or critical risk issue is still communicated to the client as soon as possible. And so that might be a summary of findings, or it may be a draft report. So the summary of findings is essentially the findings and recommendation section just cut out of the larger report. And the reason that we sometimes take that approach is again, to allow you to see what is really technically the most important part of the project. We let you see each finding, the associated hosts, and some qualitative and quantitative risk ratings for those issues as we believe them to be. And so that gives you the chance to start working while we continue to produce that draft report. In the case of an actual pre-QA draft that we might provide, that would typically happen in the case of a smaller scope project. But that pre-QA draft is essentially the entire report, short some QA process that happens on our end to correct maybe some formatting issues, grammar, punctuation, things that pen testers aren't typically very good at. So the next point here, the targeted retesting, that's really again, this is once you've received your results and you start to take action, perform some remediation on the issues that you found. Then we offer, as a part of our service, the ability to go in and do a targeted retesting against those issues that are identified. So essentially what that looks like is a targeted test of specific issues that made it into the report. So a particular, host and finding would be tested together, but we wouldn't do a full, test of the entire environment again. And then lastly, once we've done that remediation testing, if you have opted to go that route, we'll then, finalize that report with notes on remediation, showing the issues that still remain and the issues that you've corrected. Just basically notating throughout the report what the current status is of those issues. Once that's done, it goes back through our QA process and is ultimately delivered, to the client. So I probably should have introduced before we did this, but so this is the resources I mentioned right up front. So there's not much to see in the slide here, but essentially HHS.gov is, security role professionals is a section of the site, and there are a number of really good resources there. If you're trying to understand impacts of security testing and the requirements that the HIPAA security rule has there. There are also a number of newsletters that you can read there that will help you to understand what other HIPAA other covered entities and business associates are seeing from HHS with regards to, HIPAA security and what's going on, at that time that the newsletters are released. The second point there is really just pointing to that section of the security rule, the standard evaluation section, in case you want to go there and read the full text and make any connections to other sections of the HIPAA law. And the last point, again, SP 866 Revision 1. Again, there's not a link there, but it's fairly easy to find that on Google, and if you need it, I'm sure we can provide that for you. But there's a larger document, certainly because this is focused on penetration testing, we talked about the evaluation section and specifically about penetration testing. But that document is also good for other areas related to HIPAA compliance. And these are just some resources for penetration testing in general. So, NIST SP 800-115 is not necessarily a framework, but it gives you information to help you understand, what you should be looking for when you perform a penetration test. These others are just some open source methodologies that are used in the penetration testing realm. Point 2, 4, and 5 are specific to, well, not specific to, but are heavily focused on infrastructure, but also have some, web application components. And the Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP, is specifically focused on web application testing in the penetration testing realm. So all of those are really, really good resources. If if you're at square one, you don't, beyond what I've said today, you still want more information about penetration testing, about, various methodologies that might be used. They're great resources to sort of educate yourself so that when you start the process of looking for a firm to perform penetration testing, or if you have the resources, start to perform penetration testing yourself, that you know what's expected, what those various methodologies are, and how you might execute against those.
And I will send out all of the links to these resources in an email tomorrow. So anything that Sean has mentioned that you want to see more of, we'll provide those links for you. I just wanted to open it up for any questions. Use that Q&A feature or the chat feature on WebEx, and we'll get those answered. Our next webinar will actually be totally focused on questions. It'll be an hour of Q&A with Sean, and we'd love to get those questions beforehand. So if you think of a question after today, just email me, find a link on the website. It's up everywhere, so you can just register for it and submit your questions. One question for you, Sean, that has come in. Can you kind of talk about the pros and cons of a black box test? That may seem like the best approach, or kind of the benefits of that.
Yeah, so I guess the pros from an organization's perspective is that you get to see, based on the skills of the attacker, obviously, or the penetration testing firm, you get to see what sort of things can be identified about your organization on the internet that you might not have otherwise seen. So if you take a white box approach, typically, like I said, the reconnaissance is minimized, and so there are certainly things out there that are very valuable to know about your own organization, whether that be the fact that a certain number of your employees were included in a particular type of breach, of an external site using corporate email or something. You can understand more about what, for example, if you have active developers that work within your organization, when you start to take that black box approach, you understand more about what they're doing online, because a heavy focus is on that reconnaissance. And so it's very much what you would see if you were thinking about, back several years ago when Anonymous was, all over the news. You get to see what someone that was part of that hacking collective might do, or LulzSec, or any one of these other groups, when they have to rely solely on open source intelligence. So that's sort of the pros of it, is that, ability to gain insight that you just really don't have any other way of gaining other than maybe trying to do that yourself. The cons, and I think I mentioned this a little bit before, is that when you perform a black box approach, because there is such a heavy focus on reconnaissance, it can have a large impact on the amount of time that's spent on the engagement. Now, that time may be very productive and fruitful, but it does take away from, from the overall active testing that might take place. And again, that depends on how you structure your testing and if there are limits on one phase versus the next. Some other, other cons obviously is just the fact that there may be a significant amount of, interaction between you and the tester that's required for legal reasons. I mean, obviously that tester is going to go out and identify all that information that I mentioned before, but they can't just blindly start testing it like a real hacker would. And that's because that might be owned by a third party. It might not actually belong to your organization at all, and it just so happens that the contact information or something that put that on their radar, it may not be accurate. And so there's a lot more interaction that needs to take place, to make sure that that tester is not going, outside of the law and testing against something that's not permitted. So again, that just increases the amount of time spent just on communication that isn't really spent on active testing. There's also the chance that a lot of things will be missed. So when you talk about a black box approach, if you take it in its purest form, the tester is going to tell you what they found, and you're going to allow them to test that or make limitations if necessary. But you wouldn't necessarily say, oh, well, you missed these, 500 systems that are running, over here, or whatever the case may be. So there's a definite opportunity to miss things that should be included. And again, talking about the purest form of black box, your organization, may have given, a little bit more information, but still fits into the black box mold. And you may not know what was missed until the project is entirely over. So certainly that's a huge con to black box testing, is that you have less control, over what gets focused on and what may be missed in that scope of testing.
Another question about the approach. If doing a white box internal test, are you hitting all devices or randomly selecting them based on what you test?
So yeah, during the white box approach, we're definitely not just just letting things, just attacking everything. So we certainly try to leverage what we know about your environment. So if we know that there are a particular set of systems where the target data, and like I said, in this case EPHI, if we know where those flow or where they're stored, we're going to try and focus on those things. Now that's not to say that we won't test some of those other systems that are in the environment as well, but the goal is to show you what a real attacker might do, and realistically a real attacker is not going to go in unless they just they accidentally got in and they're not very sophisticated. They're not going for everything. They're going to be targeted in their approach. They're going to pick those things that they believe, based on the information that they've collected, are the most important systems in the environment, and start to work toward those. Whether that includes exploiting a secondary system to hopefully exploit some trust between that system they were actually able to exploit and the system that they're trying to pivot to. But the goal overall should be to to focus on where that sensitive data is and how best to get to it. But again, there's when you talk about your goals for testing, as I mentioned earlier, in the webinar, that's one of the things that you'll want to talk to your penetration tester about. You definitely don't want to assume that everyone takes the same approach. So you definitely want to express your desire to have a particular approach if you have something in mind. So if your goal is to understand as much as you can about as many of your systems in your environment, that sort of goes back to my what to test discussion earlier, and talking about the time, the complexity, and that sort of thing. So just understand that if that is what you're looking for, that you do want attention paid to everything in the environment, that you may have to specify that and understand that may come with strings attached as far as financial aspect and that sort of thing.
Thank you, Sean. That's all the questions that we had come in today. But again, our next webinar will be Q&A. So if you think of a question, please email it to me. My email is on the screen. Or when you register for the next webinar, there will be a place to submit questions anonymously. So we'll get you back the rest of the hour. Sean, did you have anything else to say?
So, I did notice one more question there. I don't know if maybe you slid past it. They were asking about pricing and how we do pricing. Is that something that we speak to on these webinars typically, or?
That question didn't pop up for me. I'm glad it popped up for you. Yeah, you can speak to that, Sean, if you'd like to. or you can pass along the name to me afterwards, and I can answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak at a high level. I certainly don't want to speak for sales on our end, but you know, typically for infrastructure testing, Kirkpatrick price charges based on the number of IPs that are considered to be in scope. You know, so like I mentioned earlier in the webinar, we want to understand, you know, that scope as best we can so that we're getting a realistic picture of what, you know, what that scope should look like and what the cost and effort associated with that is. So yeah, on the infrastructure side, we focus primarily on the IP count. We do also have some slight modifiers depending on the number of networks that we need to test, particularly on the internal side. If we're testing a number of segmented networks, you know, we do have a modifier to sort of reflect the effort that's involved with jumping to that next segment and testing there, which may include, you know, different types of hardware and software and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, the primary driver is IPs. On the web application side, it's kind of, you know, it used to be very easy to say the number of pages in an application. But as we move into more, you know, APIs and single-page applications and other things that are less focused on the number of pages, we start to look at unique functionality. So in the API world, it's easy to see that unique functionality is typically, you know, based on the number of endpoints that are in that API. Typically, there's not a lot of redundancy in API endpoints. There isn't a lot of reason for that. So we would, you know, price based on the number of endpoints, and then back that out if there are any endpoints that are read-only, meaning that we send in a request without really any parameters, and we just get a response back based on that request and the authorization level we have. We back out some of the effort assigned to that, and obviously that affects the price. On the pure web app side, we do, again, try to focus on the unique functionality in the application. If the approach is that we want to take a particular workflow or look at a particular user type, you know, and the authorization that user has, that can sort of affect the way that we price that. But generally, it's unique functionality. And again, like with the API, we try to back out for anything that is duplicate functionality in the application, meaning that if we have a search box on 2 different pages, but it does the exact same thing, we obviously are not going to be testing that twice, you know, other than to confirm the same result. So we're not going to charge you twice for that. Another example would be if you have multiple areas in an application where you can enter, let's say, patient data in this example. If the actual function that's called, you know, the request that's made after that entry is the same, we're not going to charge you for every place that you might enter patient data. So unique functionality, backing out for any duplication, and that's primarily how we price those.
We actually had one more question come in, Sean. Is the result of testing a certificate or just a report?
So it's a report, and we take a very, you know, quick look, you know, or a quick, we make a quick opinion of your security posture based on the overall, you know, results of testing. So in our reports, that looks like sufficient or insufficient with respect to the systems that we test. So specifically saying that we consider your security program to be sufficient or insufficient. Now, there's no certification when it comes to penetration testing, and it's not really a pass or fail sort of situation. But that really, you know, that our determination of sufficient or insufficient comes from the whole of the testing process. So, you know, that would include the number and percentage of critical and high-risk issues, you know, the prevalence of you know, unpatched software or significantly out-of-date software and operating systems, and like I said, just really looking at the whole of the data that we collected and making a determination off of that.
Great, thanks, John. That's it for today. We hope that you join us next time. Thank you so much, Sean. That was great information, a great kind of in-depth on pen testing. Hope everyone has a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time.